All right, welcome back, everybody. We are on recording, yeah, our second topic today, and we're gonna have a talk with Mike Duncan. As Charles mentioned, is an author of Hero of the Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette, and the Age of Revolution. Just a quick plug for Mike. If you have never done one of his Revolutions podcast, please take advantage of that. They really are amazing. I got through the first three. The Haitian Revolution beat me down, and then I got back in with with the Mexican Revolution. So sometimes some stories you love more, and sometimes some hit more with you. So, but I remember in the American Revolution one, um, Lafayette was so important. I think that, Mike, is when you eventually did the book after you had done that. So, um, we're going to be interviewed here by Bobby Ticknor. Bobby's a research associate, a reference associate at the Historic New Orleans Collection. Also helps me out with the symposium, and is part of the Louisiana Historical Society as well as the LGBTQ Archive of Louisiana. So I want to welcome you guys both, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
So I got Mike's book right here, and just to everyone out there, it's got all the academic research you can do. He was in the archives in France reading these letters, but it's written for a general audience. It's a great scholarly work, but isn't going to be dry, obscure, or like confusing. It's not heavy on theory, but it's a very readable book, and I highly recommend it to everyone listening out here. I learned quite a bit from reading it. And it is an entire biography of his life from beginning to end. We're only focusing on a small part of that today, which is his role in the American Revolution. But just to go back, Charles had asked a couple questions, and I wanted to start with that. And the first one Charles had was if Lafayette's born in southern France and then moving as a young teenager to northern France, if the differences in culture and society between those kind of affected his disposition, outlook, perspective. So, what do you think?
I think that they really did. Lafayette is going to become like this very rich noble who comes from Versailles, like in the minds of the Americans, he's this very like inner circle plugged in rich noble. But when he is born, he's really, it's not just that he's coming from the south of France, it's that he's coming from the sticks. This is a part of France that is not very populated. This is a very, very rural and isolated part of France. It's very far from Paris. And in the 18th century, Paris is one of the most sophisticated and culturally important cities in the world as it is today, but I think back then even more so. And so the thing that really affects Lafayette's like long-term disposition and his long-term outlook on everything is he comes from this very rural area where he's the biggest thing going, right? He's the little lord of Chavignac. Everywhere he goes, people have to doff their caps to him. Like he's the biggest thing around. And then when he goes to Paris, when he's like an early teenager, now he is in this gigantic world that he wasn't raised in. He doesn't really understand the manners. He's a bit of a backwards country bumpkin, to make it like legible for everyone. And so him coming into that world makes him feel very uncomfortable. And he is never actually comfortable in Paris or in Versailles as a young man because of how he had been raised. And as a result of that, that's what gets him to wanting to slough a lot of that stuff off and go find adventure someplace else. And there is therefore, I think, a reason why he's very comfortable like in the hardships of Valley Forge in a way that he is never quite comfortable in like the gilded luxury of Versailles.
Excellent. That sounds really good. Makes a lot of sense. Charles asked, did he have a southern accent? Do we know the answer to that?
Oh, well, I mean, he does not speak what I don't, he's not coming from sort of like the really heavily Greek influence. Like he's not from Marseille. He's not from sort of the French Riviera. But he does definitely have like rustic colloquialisms and a rustic way about him. He's not refined Parisian at all from the beginning anyway.
And so Charles also went through some of the causes leading up to him joining the American Revolution. He had the money. He maybe the Masonic connections, some of the other things. But one thing Charles didn't hit on, but I think is very important is his age and his desire to seek adventure and fortune. It's not all principle. There is some youth and adventurousness. And I believe he's 19 when he comes to New Orleans, or not to New Orleans, sorry, to America. Can you talk about like that side of this part of his
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Lafayette, he says later in his life that like from a young age, he thought of nothing but wanting to like go have big adventures to earn renown, fame, admiration. And in this way, like he comes from a long line of sword nobles. He comes from a long line of soldiers who had served, right, who'd served the king. And so Lafayette, from a young age, viewed himself as somebody who was going to grow up, have a military career, participate in great battles, go on great adventures, and that is how he was going to become known. And he really does have an appetite for that kind of fame, right? He wants to distinguish himself in the world. He has that ambition. And ambition like that can go many directions, right? That can take you to say, like, I'll do anything to be famous. I'll believe anything. I'll say anything. I'll do anything just to, like, become rich and famous. But I never found Lafayette to be that way, because also from a young age, he has this idealistic streak where he's growing up in the milieu kind of the French Enlightenment, and he is imbibing these ideas about the possibility of progress, of human progress, of making the world a better place than how you had found it, which wasn't necessarily like the prevailing ideology in France when he is born, but it becomes that. It becomes, how can we fix things that are broken? How can we improve things that can be made better? And I think that Lafayette himself believed all of these things, and especially in the social sphere, which is, if people are suffering, how can we alleviate their suffering? If there are ideas about tyranny and oppression, and we'd like to have something more like freedom and liberty, how do we actually accomplish that? And so when he goes looking for the things that are going to earn him renown and earn him fame, he wants to do something idealistic, to further all that. And this is how, like, when he learns about the American Revolution, right? He's a young officer in the French army. When he first hears about the fact that these like rustic backwoods farmers, which is, not unlike the environment he grew up in, are trying to throw off the yoke of British tyranny, this is exactly the kind of progressive cause and liberal cause that can allow him to go off and have an adventure and earn renown for himself, but in the service of something good.
And just a little anecdote that came out of your book is, I think it's chapter 3 is titled "Why Not," and that comes from the idea that Lafayette changed the motto of his house, in a heraldic sense of house, to "Cur Non," which means "Why not," and it kind of shows his sense of adventure, and maybe whimsy isn't the right word, but sense of adventure and desire to go off and do these great things. So Charles talked a little about the funding of the Victory and the ship he took over here. So let's get going down on, he lands in South Carolina, Georgetown. Charles showed us the monument in Georgetown. I'm from Charleston, so it's very significant to me. Love Charleston, but it's not the most important part of this story. So let's move on past South Carolina. And he takes a carriage up to Philadelphia. And it's in Philadelphia that he gets in touch with the Continental Congress and George Washington. And you want to talk a little bit about that experience, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, Lafayette had, as we said, at the age of 19, he's very young. He's been granted this commission in the Continental Army to be a major general, not a captain, not a colonel, not, lieutenant, a major general. Like, that's the highest rank in the Continental Army. He's been granted this commission by Silas Deane back in Paris, except that by the time that Silas Deane is granting Lafayette this commission, communications between North America and Europe have been really severed by the Royal Navy. The British ships are patrolling everywhere. So Silas Deane is kind of out there working on his own, doing what he thinks is best, giving these commissions to these various French officers. Because when Lafayette shows up in Philadelphia, he's accompanied by a whole group of French officers, and they're their belief is that they're going to show up in Philadelphia and have the Continental Congress be like, amazing. We're so glad you're here. We finally have some good officers, oh, Lafayette, we know who you are. This is great. They'll roll out the red carpet for him. And really, when he shows it, they almost quite literally shut the door in his face. They go to Hancock, they go to John Hancock's house, and Hancock is like, you're not my problem. Go talk to Robert Morris. They go to Robert Morris's house and they're like, come back tomorrow. Maybe we'll talk to you. They come back tomorrow. They're not going to talk to Robert Morris. They bring out this other guy who can speak French. And this guy tells them in no uncertain terms, what Silas Deane is. We didn't give Silas Deane any approval for him to give out these commissions. We don't recognize your claim to a place in the Continental Army. And in fact, you and all of these European officers who keep, washing up on our shores are doing nothing but causing us stress and headaches. And you are arrogant and you demand a bunch of money and you don't even speak English. So like, what are we even to do with you? And at the same time, like literally weeks before Lafayette shows up, George Washington is writing the Continental Congress saying, like, we have to stop with all of these French officers. We have to stop with all these European officers. They're absolutely driving us insane. And so the very first sort of response that Lafayette gets in the United States, this country that is going to love him for the rest of his life, is to say, like, we don't want you. We don't know you. Go home. And it is not until a couple of days later that some letters do arrive, including one from Benjamin Franklin. And what Benjamin Franklin writes is, hey, just so you know, there is a young, rich French marquis who is probably going to show up with a commission to be a major general in the Continental Army. You have to protect him at all costs. Like, you have to bring him into the cause because he knows King Louis. He knows Marie Antoinette. We need the French to be on our side in this war, or we are going to lose. And what Lafayette represents is a direct line to the royal family back in France. So whatever you do, if he shows up, please don't let him die, and treat him really well. And everything will be great. And so then the Continental Congress comes around about 2 days later and they're like, oh, hi. There was some misunderstanding earlier, but we definitely like to now talk to you about having a role in our Continental Army.
But still, making a 19-year-old a general is not necessarily a wise military decision, especially a 19-year-old who had very limited military experience at all before coming here. So was his appointment ceremonial or not?
Yeah, his both in the text around the commission that Deane gives him in the first place back in Paris, and then again when it's confirmed by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the Americans are making it very clear that he's being given this role for ceremonial and political reasons, right? He's not getting a commission as a major general because they've identified Alexander the Great, who is going to be this great young general who's going to lead them to victory. Lafayette, as you said, has like basically no military experience at all at this point. But they highlight his own personal wealth. They highlight his connections to the court back in France. Those are the things that are going to give him this commission, because that's what Lafayette wants in order to that's where he sees himself fitting into all of this. So the Congress is telling Washington, look, we've made him a major general, but clearly he's 19 years old and we don't expect him to be leading troops in battle, nor should you. But because there is still a language barrier, Lafayette has interpreted all of this to mean that, yes, he really is actually a major general who will be treated as an equal major general alongside, these people who are going to become his comrades in arms, and that he will be leading troops in battle. And so there's early tension between Lafayette and Washington and the rest of the army about what he's actually meant to be doing.
Did we lose you, Bobby?
Did we lose me or lose him?
No, I think we lost him.
Okay.
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah,
There you go.
I don't know if it's my connection. Mike was cutting in and out. I heard most of it, but it might be on my end.
I think it might be on your end. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Cool. We're clear now. So let's talk about his relationship with Washington. He does meet Washington at this dinner in August of 1777. And we do need to get into the chronology of the battles, but Washington's a relationship that affects Lafayette his whole life. And Charles told us he named his first son George Washington. But let's So let's kind of talk about use this opportunity to talk about the lifelong respect and connection he has with George Washington. And then we'll
Yeah.
get into the chronology of the revolution.
Yeah. The Washington, like, other than like a few close family members, George Washington represents the most important relationship in Lafayette's life. And there's little bits of like sort of psychological explanations for this. Lafayette was his father died when he was 2 years old. His mother died when he was just a kid. So he was an orphan, and he shows up in the United States, meets George Washington, and sees in George Washington like this real exemplar of everything that Lafayette would like to have for himself. He believes that Washington is fighting for a noble, just, progressive, liberal cause. He notices that every time George Washington walks into a room, he commands respect. He's got this dignity and authority that is just really imbued in Washington's character that Lafayette would like to emulate. And so when he meets Washington, he sees somebody who can be his mentor, maybe a surrogate father figure, and then really for the rest of Lafayette's life, an idea and a role model that Lafayette can pattern himself off of. And if we project, further into his life, like during the French Revolution and even during his later days, you can see Lafayette constantly asking the question, like, what would George Washington do in a situation like this? Because he really saw Washington as this, this moral leading light and somebody whose character deserves to be emulated. Now, on Washington's side, like I just said, for even the weeks leading up to Lafayette showing up, Washington is like, I've had it with French officers. I don't want to deal with any more of these people. And then he gets down to Philadelphia, and they're like, oh, by the way, you now have this 19-year-old French aristocrat you have to like shepherd around with you and deal with. And Washington's like, I'm not very happy about this at all. But Lafayette is so endearing and is unique among the French officers for like his willingness to learn how to speak English instead of just trying to speak French, his willingness to pay his own way through the army. And then, as we'll get into in a sec, I think some of his courage and the way that he displays himself on the battlefield and as a soldier inside the army, that it becomes very clear to Washington that this kid is not just somebody who's along for the ride. He's not just somebody who's there to play act a little bit and then go home. Like, he's really serious about this. He takes it all very seriously. He respects the Americans in Washington in particular very much. And all of that brings Washington then closer to Lafayette in a way that Lafayette wanted to be close to Washington. And throughout the years of the war, they're in the same tents as each other. They're sleeping alongside each other. And this becomes a truly lifelong bond between them.
And Washington often calls him his son, I think.
Yeah.
In letters. And what doesn't he send Washington? I mean, this gets into the French Revolution, but some of the keys to the Bastille are sent to Mount Vernon later.
Oh, yeah. One of the keys to the Bastille, Lafayette sent back to him, in 1789, and it's still hanging in Mount Vernon to this very day. You can see it.
So he does seek his. He finds the military action he is seeking, and I've written down a couple of the battles or skirmishes. We don't have to talk in great detail about troop movements and topography, but Brandywine is the first one, and something significant happens to him there as he gets injured. So can you tell us a little bit about that and what happens?
Yeah, so the Battle of Brandywine is, the British have landed on the coast. They are coming up there trying to capture Philadelphia. And what Washington and the Continental Army are going to try to do is block that and prevent the British from taking Philadelphia. And that's why the Battle of Brandywine happens. And this is all like within weeks. This is September of 1777. Lafayette has shown up in Philadelphia. I forget if it's the end of July, beginning of August, but he has not been with the army for very long when Brandywine shows up. And also, like we said, we're talking about a 19-year-old kid who doesn't really have any battlefield experience at all. He wants to be a great soldier. He wants to do great things and be renowned for his heroism. But I don't think any of us can really know what we're going to do in battle until we are actually faced with bullets whizzing over our heads and like the actual thunder and crash and reality that we might be severely injured, that we might actually die. I've never served in the military, and I don't know what any of that is like. And so I honestly have no idea how I would respond to any of that. And we all like to imagine ourselves doing great and heroic things. But like, if I'm really in that kind of mortal danger, I'm not sure that I know how I would respond. And I'm not sure that Lafayette necessarily would have known either. Um, except that when the Battle of Brandywine starts and they find out he's alongside Washington, Ben Franklin has said to Washington, like, you can't let this kid die. He's very important. And so the intention is to keep Lafayette out of the fighting. But when he finds out that one particular flank, the right flank at Brandywine, is crumpling under a charge by Cornwallis, Lafayette is like, I want to go towards that fighting. I want to go where things are the worst so that I can help. And he does. He goes to that part of the line. He does his best under fire to encourage the people who are holding that line to stand fast. He's like pushing people forward. He gets shot through the leg. He's bleeding out of his boots. He's starting to get dizzy from a loss of blood. Does that make him run away? Is he like, oh, I'm a French aristocrat. I just got a scratch. I better run away. No, he keeps going. And it's not until Washington comes around to that part of the fighting that he says, like, okay, we have to retreat. You are injured. You have to retreat. So Lafayette does. He follows that order. He retreats. But instead of, again, just like going and finding a doctor and quitting the field entirely, he sees that there is a very important bridge, that if the Americans can hold that bridge, then more of the militia and more of the Continental soldiers can retreat. Like, he wants to protect this bridge. So he organizes a defense of that bridge while injured, while not even knowing these people for very long. He's doing all, and that's where Washington finds him again. And these are the moments that, like, I think, number one, lead Washington to the conclusion that I think that this kid might be different from the others. And then I think that for Lafayette personally, in terms of the story of his own life, like, this is a moment of truth that he's been waiting for, that people back in France maybe don't think he's even capable of, because they know that Lafayette has done all of this, that he's like escaped to the New World and he's going to go off and fight, but it's not clear how he's going to respond. And I think he basically responds splendidly with great courage, and shows, not just Washington and the Continental Army, but really the whole world, what he's made of. And it's something special.
And then Gloucester's the next small skirmish, but this is his first experience actually leading troops in combat. And I don't know if you have much to say about it. I think it's a fairly minor skirmish in the big scheme of things, but it is important because he is now in charge, not just responding, but leads as well. And I think, does he lead a retreat in that skirmish too?
Well, no, it's less of a retreat, but yeah, because of his experience at Brandywine, Washington is like, okay, I'll give you some troops and you can read it. And he's out there with Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene's in overall charge of it. And Lafayette, again, like, identifies some soldiers and is attacking them. He's rushing them. He's not running and hiding. And Greene winds up writing back to Washington, like, after Gloucester. He's like, I don't know, the kid seems pretty good, but also he's a little reckless and we do need to keep an eye on him. So let's not let him just like run off and get killed.
And so after Gloucester, they're kind of holed up in Philadelphia, figuring out the next move. The Americans are. And Lafayette seems struck that there are so many Americans, quote, who are still loyal to the crown. And some of them are actually waiting to hear the results of the battle to know which way they want to go. If the British won the battle, some of these people are going to fall in line really quick. And I never meant anything different. I was always loyal. And there also are the Republicans and the patriots, we would say today. But one of the lines in your book struck me very, very profoundly. And it's not a line from Lafayette, it's a line you wrote. Every revolution is ultimately a civil war.
Yeah.
I think that's pertinent in the 18th century as well as the 21st century. And I want our audience to reflect on that line. I thought it was really significant. But if you want to kind of talk about, we don't have to talk about 21st century revolutions right now. You've got podcasts that handle some of that. But talk about that in the sense of Lafayette and Philadelphia after the battle.
Yeah, I mean, that line is born of having studied all of these different revolutions, where every single revolution has a civil war component to it, because the radical revolutionary side of any successful revolution is rarely even close to the majority of the population. I mean, most of the population, most of the time in most places, is indifferent to politics and doesn't participate in any of this stuff at all, just as a very basic thing. But one of Lafayette's sort of misconceptions about coming to the Americas and coming to the colonies, how they were at the time, is that the colonies were united. that every American was like this freedom-loving Republican who was invested in the cause, who was, you know, ready to fight, ready to lay down the, you know, their life, their fortune, their sacred honor on behalf of the United States, or what will become the United States. And what he discovers very quickly, really along the route from Charleston to Philadelphia, is when he's first getting a glimpse of this, and then later during the war, is that the freedom-loving Republican side is just one small subset, and that there are lots and lots and lots of colonial Americans who are opposed to the revolution. They are like, why are we going to break away from this big, glorious thing called the British Empire that protects us, that gives us great trade, you know, opportunities, who we are, you know, we're all Englishmen and English women. Why would we break away from this? And also, it's crazy. We're just poor. We're relatively poor colonials. They are one of the richest and most powerful empires on the planet. Like, why fight this battle? And so, like you said, in Philadelphia before the Battle of Brandywine, the population like kind of split into two groups. And there was one group who was waiting and hoping that George Washington and the Continentals would win. And then there was an equally sized number of people who were hoping that the British would win, and that they would be liberated from like these maniac radicals who were trying to like destroy everything that they cared about in the world, that they were going to lose their property, not to the British, but to these American radicals. And that is something that Lafayette really has to come to terms with. And a lot of his experience during the American Revolution is having these like very early, broad, idealistic sense of what was going on in America really be tempered by, and have the scales fall away from his eyes, that lots of people were actively opposed to the revolution that he was joining.
And although we're not our topic for today, but I think that experience, definitely reading the rest of your book, influences his actions and the decisions he makes during the French Revolution, and how
I think so.
What some people might say is playing both sides, is he's actually trying to protect a lot of people who don't want to get involved in chaos and violence one way or the other. It's not, there's a practicality to some of this that isn't always as principled as you might like, but it's still an important side of the story. Next up is Valley Forge. This is the hard winter where guys have holes in their boots and don't have blankets and all this kind of stuff. And Lafayette is there with George Washington.
Yeah, and this is, you know, again, one of those things that the Americans find endearing about Lafayette, and frankly, I find endearing about him too, is that when he's back at Versailles in all of this like splendid silk luxury surround, you know, this is one of the most luxurious places on the planet, and he's plugged into you know, one of the most pampered sets of aristocrats you've ever seen, and he can't get comfortable in his own skin in Versailles. But then when he's in Valley Forge and conditions are rough and he's cold along with everybody else, it's not clear whether or not anything is going to hold together. He's like, this is where I feel at home, right? This is where I feel comfortable. Even if I'm freezing and we're all having a miserable time of it, I'm happier and more comfortable here than I was back there at Versailles. And here he, you know, so he's there for this critical transformation of the army, which he helps participate in, which really comes down to, you know, Baron von Steuben coming into the mix and really drilling the American soldiers in a way that is going to teach them finally how to be, you know, real sort of European style troops. And Lafayette is right there, you know, as somebody who can translate, like literally translate what von Steuben is saying so that the Americans can understand it. And he's there and participating in all of this in a way that by the time that they come out of Valley Forge, you know, Lafayette is absolutely just in the family. He's one of the brothers, one of the sons. He's, you know, he's not just an outsider who has shown up. He's now deeply in this. And he's encouraged to go home several times. And he's like, no, like I've shed my blood here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm in this to the end.
So the next thing that comes up is kind of a failed enterprise, which is there was talk of having a Quebec campaign. It gets scrapped, but they do have a meeting with the Six Nations and some of the Native American tribes. And Lafayette is selected by, I guess, Washington and some of the Americans to help negotiate. And again, ultimately it falls apart. But he does have this important meeting with the Native Americans, and they actually give him a nickname. And some Native Americans of the Oneida tribe later do send a small delegation to fight underneath him. Let's talk about that relationship and the nickname they give him.
Yeah. So Lafayette's relationship with these Native American tribes is really interesting. And the reason he is invited to do this, the reason why he's frankly asked to go talk to the Iroquois, is that the Iroquois do not trust these Anglo settlers at all. And during the American War of Independence, they see their interests as a nation, as the Iroquois, these Six Nations. They believe that the British, far more than these American settlers, are going to respect their land claims, their national traditions, their own rights, and their own their own interests, in a way that it's very clear that the sort of quote unquote native, the white population of the Eastern Seaboard is looking to move west. And one of the subtle causes of the American Revolution is the British trying to shut down this migration from east to west and to prevent the white settlers who were on the Eastern Seaboard from moving inland and taking their land. The Indians have a very different relationship with the French, basically, than they do with the Anglo-Americans, because the French have been in this region, in Canada, around the backwoods, the Great Lakes, up and down the Mississippi. The French have been there for a long time. And the French have always been primarily interested in trade. They were never really interested in the kind of like colonial projects that the Anglo settlers were. And so they don't fear the French as much as they do the Anglo-Americans. And so bringing Lafayette in as a Frenchman, they're now able to say like, hey, look, you as a French guy who they might actually listen to, can you go talk to them and try to secure some kind of peace or understanding? And, it works a little bit during the American War of Independence. For the most part, the Iroquois are like, no, we're sticking with the British. And there's a big diaspora that happens after the Americans win. But Lafayette plays this role several times. This is the first time he plays that role. He plays it again after the war, and then he plays it again finally, when he comes back for the big tour in 1824 and 1825, that he wants to be somebody who can bridge the gap between the Native Americans and between the white settlers. And he always is encouraging the white settlers to treat the natives with respect and with dignity. And he's always encouraging the Native Americans to see the whites not as their enemies and not as encroachers, but as friends in like a mixed society that can move forward. And unfortunately for Lafayette, it just really seems like in the big picture of things that his attempt to navigate this and try to bridge the gap is overrun by the fact that the sort of the land hunger of the white settlers is going to push all the Indians away. And that what the things that Lafayette was promising about their friendship and how we can trust them, often does not actually come to pass.
But they respect him enough. They give him this name.
And to that point, he's adopted into one of their tribes, right? They think so highly of him that they bring him in and make him a member of the tribe. And he also takes home when he goes back to France, he takes a couple of young sort of like Native American wards with him to educate them in Europe, to give them like full European educations, and then send them back so that they can interact and be sort of advocates and ambassadors for their own civilization when they're talking to what is going to be the newly independent United States.
And the nickname is Kayula, or
Kayuela. Yeah, there's a bunch of different.
It was the name of a formidable warrior from a generation or two before, and so they're giving him it's a significant name from someone who is important. And then later on, the Oneida do send it's a small group, but about 50 warriors to join one of Lafayette's, I don't know, battalions or units, and they do fight underneath him.
Yeah, okay, and some of them die under his command.
Yeah. So the next couple battles, I just have quick notes about, and I don't know how much detail you would like to talk about them, Mike, but Barren Hill, Monmouth, and Rhode Island. Those are the next three in order, and he's involved in all three of those.
Yeah, and this is where Lafayette's record, as a soldier, I actually think he's underrated as an officer. I think there are a lot of people, if you want to speak negatively of Lafayette, you say like, oh, he wasn't even that good of an officer. And I disagree with that. I think he was good, but his record was mixed. And so sort of after he's proven himself at Brandywine and through Valley Forge, You know, like for example, Washington gives him this opportunity to go like reconnoiter and do like a scouting mission around British occupied Philadelphia. And Washington tells him explicitly, like, don't camp in the same place 2 nights in a row. But Lafayette does camp 2 nights in a row. And because he stays there that second night, the British are tipped off that he's there, and he's very nearly captured, right? There's a middle of the night raid that is undertaken by the British. They very nearly capture Lafayette, and he just gets away by the skin of his teeth. And Washington says, "Oh well, it was a very handsome retreat." And then at Monmouth Court, and then once we're out of Valley Forge, all the things that von Steuben has done and all the things that the Continental officers have done to drill the men and train the men is then put on full positive display at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, which is, I think, one of the first times in the war where the Continental Army goes toe to toe with the British Army. And it's, I think technically you would call it a stalemate. But after the end of the stalemate, the British are the ones who quit the field, and the Continental Army is the one who's left in charge of it. And so Monmouth Courthouse is one of these sort of great proving ourselves victories for the Continental Army and for the Americans. But Lafayette, unfortunately, was a part of the vanguard that was being led by Charles Lee. And Charles Lee was kind of opposed to the entire operation that led to the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. He was dragging his feet. He was a critic of George Washington. Charles Lee famously made several blunders and miscommunications during this part of the battle, and Lafayette was in Charles Lee's vanguard. So when Lafayette would later talk about sort of his great, there was Brandywine, and I was at Yorktown, and I did this. Like, Monmouth Courthouse is never featured in his later resume, like his greatest hits from the American Revolution, because it didn't really go great for him. But then he pops back to life, I think, in a major way, because all of these examples of the Americans being able to hold their own against the British, and Gates winning at Saratoga, and I think Monmouth Courthouse here is proving to France that it is a good idea for them to join the war, that they won't just be joining up with some people who are going to lose, that they might be joining up with some people who could actually win this thing. And so in Rhode Island, this is the first battle that is going to be fought by the French and the Americans together. So once the French fleet has shown up, there are French Marines who are showing up. And Lafayette is very excited because he finally gets to sort of like work these two sides together. And this is, the French and the Americans working together. This is Anglo-Protestant farmers lining up with these like absolute monarchist Catholic Frenchmen. And they've been enemies for hundreds of years. Like there's no history of working together. There's only history of animosity between these two groups, between the French and the Anglos. And so Lafayette is working very, very hard to bridge those gaps. Again, he's trying to act as an intermediary between two potentially hostile groups who he thinks needs to be working together. And though the operations in Rhode Island are wrecked by a giant storm, like a tropical storm or possibly even something as big as a hurricane, Lafayette comes out well through all of this, for all of the racing around that he does to try to like keep this alliance together, which is part of the political role that makes him so important to the war.
This might be a good moment. One of the questions in the chat was about his Catholic outlook. And from reading your book, I can answer this. He was a fairly non-believing Catholic, and
yeah,
it had political concerns that he had to be aware of, but his personal beliefs were not very strong, if at all. And that was why he maybe was a good candidate to do some of this negotiating, because he wasn't burning with religious passion the way some other people were. His wife in particular has a very different perspective, and that's interesting later, but not what we have time for today. So the next thing is he takes a little interlude, goes back to France, trying to raise money, support troops, ships, etc. We don't have a lot of time here, and I don't want to go too much over. So let's maybe just skip through that. No, he does go back, does acquire some money and support, comes back to America, and finds himself fighting in Virginia. And he thinks he's being sidelined to some extent, but George Washington has a plan that is going to lead to the end of the war. And let's talk about that for a moment, please.
Yeah, so Lafayette goes back to France for a year to raise money and stuff for the cause. And then when he returns, he comes back, he rejoins the Continental Army as a major general. And shortly thereafter, the real catalyst for the next phase of Lafayette's, career in the Continental Army is the betrayal by Benedict Arnold. And it is, Lafayette is with Washington in Washington's little company when they come through West Point and realize that Arnold has betrayed the army and is potentially going to betray away West Point. And they're all shocked by this. They're all horrified by this. And Lafayette's intention through the entire war is to serve alongside George Washington. He doesn't want to leave Washington's side. He's not interested in going anywhere else. That's where he wants to be. And they all believe that New York City is going to be where the final battle is fought, because this is the stronghold of the British presence in the United States. And so he doesn't want to leave. But then word comes from Virginia that Benedict Arnold, who is now defected to the British, who's been given his own commission and is now leading troops in battle for the British instead of the Americans, is down in Virginia raiding around. And Washington needs to send somebody that he can trust, somebody who can lead Continental troops in battle, who can go down there to Virginia, fight off Benedict Arnold, hopefully capture him, and then hang him from the nearest tree. And there's a great line in Washington's instructions to Lafayette before he sends him to Virginia, which is like, allow nothing to stand between you and the summary justice that must be visited upon, Arnold. And so that's what gets Lafayette to go down there. That's the thing that's going to move him, is he doesn't want to leave Washington, but Washington is saying, you have to go catch and kill the guy who so egregiously betrayed this cause and betrayed us personally. And so that's what takes Lafayette down to Virginia. And that campaign, there's lots of ins and outs of that campaign now that Lafayette is in Virginia. And ultimately, Arnold's command is superseded by somebody else. So Lafayette never gets the chance to capture Arnold, but now he's representing the Continental Army in this theater of the war, just as Cornwallis is coming up from the Carolinas. And this is all building towards Yorktown, which nobody knew that Yorktown was going to be the end of the war. Washington himself, Lafayette himself, definitely thought it was New York City right up till the very last minute. But once Cornwallis had gone to Virginia, once he had set up shop in Yorktown, and Lafayette is the one who is writing back and saying, like, this is where he is, this is where he's gotten, and especially like Rochambeau, who's the head of the French Expeditionary Force, who's in direct communication with the French Navy, who are going to be coming up from the Caribbean. They're looking at this and they are saying, oh man, we've got Cornwallis trapped. Like, if we go down there with both of our armies, the French army and the Continental Army, Lafayette is holding the fort down there. He's got a cordon line built up so that Cornwallis can't escape. And we bring in the French Navy to bottle him up so he can't get away at all. Then we're popping the biggest army that the British have, and very probably, bringing the war to a conclusion, because the British will have to completely redo everything they'll have to, in order to bring back the resources and the troops that they need to finish the war. It would take a huge Herculean effort. So Lafayette's role down there is, he's the one who's bottling up Cornwallis before Yorktown, and then he's in personal command of several of the important moments of the siege of Yorktown, taking a couple of redoubts during that battle, that allows the Continentals and the French to truly trap Cornwallis and have Cornwallis wave the white flag. Lafayette is there for every single part of that and a major player in it.
And so that gets us to the end of the American Revolution. And we're going a little late, but Jason said we had a minute or two to go over. So there's some bigger thoughts that I want to kind of emphasize and maybe discuss here before we finish up. And the first one, and we've kind of talked about this a lot, is just how young he is. He is 19 when he gets it here. At the end of the war, he's 24, maybe 25. And that's just shocking to me. You read about these guys in history books, and you don't always think about the age. Now, he was younger than a lot of the other people involved. He is a junior to Jefferson and Washington. So there's not much to say about that. I just want to reemphasize how kind of wild it is. This guy at 19 is doing these things, and he does mature and grow a tremendous amount in those 5 years. That is awesome. The second observation I had is he meets just about every single person from the American Revolution whose name the general public knows: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Hancock, John Paul Jones, Thomas Paine. All of these guys turn up in the book. I think in my email to you, Mike, I said the only person off the top of my head that doesn't show up in your book that is commonly known as Paul Revere. Basically, everyone else here he comes across at some point in his time, and I think that's it's startling in a sense, but what I think it means is maybe that the world is smaller than we realize, and it's a lot
Mhm.
smaller than it is today. And if you go on and read the rest of Mike's book about his time in the French Revolution, he knows everyone in the French Revolution too.
Mhm.
Again, I'm not sure there's a comment here, but it struck me. But the second part of this, maybe they're not just that the world is small, but the second part of it, he really is in the middle of it. He is not a dilettante rich kid watching from the sidelines. He really is here. He knows these guys. He fights with them. He befriends them. He loves them. He writes a lot of these characters for the rest of his life. So here is my question: is Lafayette a founding father?
Ah, yes. I think that Lafayette, there's a restrictive definition of what a founding father is, which you kind of need him to be in the Second Continental Congress signing documents, like working on like Madison, Franklin, Washington. There's kind of an inner circle-ish founding fathers definition that Lafayette's not a part of. But then there's, in a more general sense, yeah, he's absolutely one of the founding fathers. He knows them all. He interacts with all of them. He is influential. He is influenced by them. And especially once you get to to project ahead to his return trip to the United States, when he's the last surviving major general, when he's interacting with the first generation of Americans who had been born after the revolution. Because when he's coming back around in 1824, there are grown adults who have lived their entire lives since the revolution happened. They weren't a part of the founding generation. And he represents to those Americans definitely him being a part of that founding generation and being a link to the American Revolution that unites them all. And that's something that I think is really important when you say Lafayette didn't just know all of these people or meet all of these people. He was on very good, friendly terms with all of these people. And the people that you listed, if you're like, he knew and was friends with Alexander Hamilton, he knew and was friends with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Hamilton wind up on two different sides of a major political battle, in the early days of the Republic. And Lafayette remains friendly with both of them. And he remains friendly with every American that he meets on all sides. I went through this one time. He personally knew the first 8 presidents. These are guys from different parties. These are guys who have different ideas about what America should be, but they all understood that Lafayette was a friend of America, and Lafayette believed that he was a friend of all Americans, regardless of their political dispositions. And I think that is really important. And I would put him amongst the founding fathers for that reason.
And he knew all the French monarchs, including
Yeah,
Napoleon.
him and Napoleon.
I
Like
mean,
he's
it
just
really is
exchanging correspondence with Napoleon. Like he knows everyone, and everyone knows him.
And I think a couple times in your book you talk about he straight up to his face tells Napoleon, "You're not doing this right."
Right.
With,
No,
right.
Lafayette is a genuinely courageous person. That is something that I've definitely taken away from all of this.
So we talked about his leadership in the field a little bit, and you said you think he's a maybe underrated. I got the sense that he's very good leading men, and he's very good like in the sense of battle, but maybe as a tactician, what we would call in the boardroom, like with maps and moving armies around. That might have not been his biggest strength. He certainly wasn't a tactician on the order of like Washington or Napoleon. Um,
Mm-mm.
so what is his legacy as a general?
Well, I think his legacy as a general, he was he was beloved by his troops. Like that's one thing. And there are ways of commanding loyalty. There are ways of commanding men in battle. You can scare the living daylights out of them. You can be mean to them. You can be taciturn. They basically like, am I more afraid of my general than I am of the enemy kind of thing. And then there are the kind of leaders who inspire real personal loyalty, and they want to follow you into battle because they care about you and because they know that you care about them. And that's one of the big lessons that Lafayette takes away from his time in the Continental Army, is that if you're going to lead a Republican army and you're going to lead these volunteers into battle, you can't just treat them like indentured, conscripts, like the way that you could in a European theater. You need to relate to them on an individual level. They need to understand why it is that they're doing what they're doing. They need to feel like their officers care about them. And I think Lafayette was very successful at all of those things. And people often commented that the morale in Lafayette's units was higher than anywhere else in the army. And I think that as you say, like he's not a tactician. He's not Alexander the Great. He's not Caesar. You know, he's not a great military leader. But the American War of Independence wasn't about tactics. It wasn't about strategy. It was about morale. You know, a lot of what Washington, you know, Washington's big role in all of this is not that he was out there like winning battles left and right. It's that he was commanding the kind of authority that is allowing the army to stay in the field to begin with, right? People are not deserting and running away from home. And I think that Lafayette's role in this was to keep together a high morale part of the army who was like, yeah, we're not going to quit. We're not going anywhere. We're going to see this thing through to the end. And that's an important part of being an officer in this particular conflict.
And so my final question right here before we take a break is I'm hoping some other people later on in the afternoon reflect on this topic too. I'm expecting they will. But the hypocrisy of the American ideals of freedom and liberty, while the entire nation is based on a slave economy, is not lost on Lafayette.
Yeah.
He his stance on abolitionism does develop over his life. He does not necessarily come at 19 as a strong abolitionist. He later does exactly become that. And these contradictions are not lost on him. He argues with Jefferson and Washington about freeing the enslaved folks in America. And so maybe talk about that a little bit, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, when Lafayette comes to the United States, he does not have a clear understanding of the distinction between slavery and liberty, and he clocks the enslaved population of the Americas as basically being servants in a way that he understands them in his aristocratic world back in France. And it is not until after the war that he really starts turning it around in his head and saying to himself, okay, well, if we just won this war for liberty and for freedom, and I now understand that the enslaved population of these colonies, what is now going to become a new nation, like slavery is literally the opposite of liberty, right? These are antonyms. You can't have liberty existing alongside slavery. He just could not fit that into his head. And so one of the things that's great about Lafayette is that he comes to this conclusion very young and very early. This is not something that takes him until like reflecting from a position of old age. This is something that he's writing back to George Washington in 1783. You know, within 2 years of the war ending, he's writing back to his friend, his mentor, his idol, who is himself enslaving hundreds of people. Dear sir, I think that we need to do something about the enslaved part of the population. Don't you? Like, shouldn't we complete this noble thing that we have done? If the glorious cause is about liberty, then yes, let's free all the slaves. And Lafayette spends the rest of his life being a committed abolitionist. And he has successes and he has failures in this, but one of his guiding North Stars for the rest of his life is that the African slave trade and African slavery needs to stop. And it is something that he is going to always be bringing up with his friends, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all these like Virginia slave owning grandees, you know, the Lawrence family down in South Carolina, they are slave owners. And he's always going to be pushing for this, even if it makes them uncomfortable, because again, Lafayette is a courageous person and an idealistic person. And he saw the end of slavery as one of the great liberal progressive causes of his era and spent the rest of his life fighting for it, even though he, you know, spent his early years creating the conditions by which, you know, that slavery was actually going to be continued and perpetuated for years to come.
And it seems like Jefferson and Washington both don't disagree with him exactly, but are more worried about the fragility of the early republic could be undermined by freeing the slaves, and the in their sense, the solidifying the republic is more important, and maybe that'll come later. It's kind of a cop out, and in some ways, you can kind of understand why someone like Washington might say that as well. But Lafayette does not believe that at all. And so one of the things when I hear a lot of people at my job sometimes talk about slavery in New Orleans, like, well, that's just how it was back then. And then you get a guy like Lafayette that proves pretty clearly not everyone accepted that. It was not this way for everyone.
It's really true.
And a lot of people were vehemently against the practice. And I think that's important to remember, especially when we reflect on New Orleans history. So that's all the questions I had. Mike, I think you did a great job. Thank you very
Well, thank you.
much. I do recommend your book to everyone out there. It was a great read, and it goes through again his whole life, not just the part we talked about today. So if there's no other questions, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike and Bobby. Thank you so much for that great interview. We're going to get started with Julian in just a few minutes. So let me get everybody in the waiting room, and we will get you started just in a few seconds. Mike, thank you so much. We really appreciate you doing this today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you,
Appreciate it,
Bobby.
Mike.
Hey, Julian, you can
How are you?
start. Good. If you want to start trying to get your PowerPoint sharing the screen and getting all that good stuff, we'll get you started in just a few minutes. Did I just put them in? Oh, sorry.
I think I was ousted.